Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 11, Freemasonry in Modern Times, from the Arcane schools, a review of their origin and antiquity, with a general history of Freemasonry and its relation to the theosophic, scientific and philosophic mysteries by John Yarker. Freemasonry in Modern Times. The pretensions that Dr. James Anderson has made for the grand masterships of numerous bishops, priests and monks should not be passed over with a shrug of contempt. Ages after architecture had been relieved from monkish trammels, the great architects were mainly clerics who have left their marks upon the soil of England. We have mentioned many such in our last chapter, and these stand out prominently. Peter, Bishop of Winchester, 1220. Eddington and Wykeham, both bishops, 1364. The work of the latter, some author observes, is stamped with a genius, almost a style in itself. Prior Bolton in conjunction with Sir Reginald Bray, 1503. And Cardinal Wolsey was a most accomplished architect, as is proved by all the buildings with which he was connected. It has been aptly said that the classic styles are the prose of architecture, Gothic its poetry, the classic its speech, and Gothic its song. The period of this chapter is the Renaissance style, which arose in Rome and spread to this country. The change of style was in part a matter of taste and in part a matter of vanity. As with the affectation of classical learning, it became the fashion to treat the brilliant Gothic as a barbarous style. The Gothic fraternity labored in bands or guilds, traveling about and disappearing when their work was accomplished, and each man left his individual stamp upon the work. As each part of a Gothic edifice supports both itself and some other part, so the free Masonic bands supported each other. Under the Renaissance, each building bears the stamp of one man, and the architect came into being with the loss of the old sodalities. With the Reformation, we have the decay of Catholic symbolism and the loss of it to the modern Freemason. With the Renaissance, we find this symbolism as a part of Catholic doctrine in the old times, carried into the erection of private buildings, and we have castles and mansions built on a cruciform basis, or in the form of variously shaped triangles, and in the shape of letters of the Roman alphabet. It is said that John Thorpe, who erected many mansions in the Elizabethan style, was a pupil of John of Padua. But it is to the Italian masters of the 17th century that we owe the preservation of the rites of guild masonry. The period which we have now reached in Freemasonry exhibits an organization which somewhat diverges from its ancient constitution, for reasons assigned in our last chapter. The articles and points of a master and fellow have become combined in one code, in a new series of constitutional charges dating from about the Reformation. York was now universally recognized as the primary seat of Masonic assembly, and London may have acquiesced in this from the fact that the oversight of Masonry rested with the Company of Freemasons, known to date from the time of Edward III, though it had a speculative lodge attached to which amateurs and others for the livery were admitted. Authorities are not quite agreed as to the original date to which we may carry back the numerous copies of Masonic manuscripts that we possess. But there seems not the slightest reason to doubt that all our modern guild charges are derived from an abridgment of the Cook and Watson manuscripts, which had become too lengthy for general use in the lodges, and with its reduction in length was associated other changes brought about by the circumstances of the times. Of this new constitution, some 70 copies have come down to us dating between 1560 to 1700, and most of them no doubt have been the official copies of masters of lodges. They are all verbal departures from some one abridged copy, made perhaps about the years 1535 to 1545. But in what locality there is nothing to show. They usually begin with an invocation to the Trinity and are addressed to the good brethren and fellows. The Euclid charge, which is the sole feature of the primitive Saxon charge, is condensed, as in the Watson manuscript, to ordain a duly passed master or a master of work, and which, in the esoteric work of a lodge, is somewhat equivalent to the installation of a master, but which would be inapplicable to a large provincial assembly met to receive fellows and past masters, as arranged for in the Athelstan constitution. The new manuscript also agrees with the present ritualistic system, as it brings into prominence the charges of David and Solomon and the assistance of Hiram of Tyre. The laws begin with a general charge to all Masons, collected out of the oldest articles and points, and then follows a charge to masters and fellows. Where an article of the master has been copied out of the oldest manuscripts, the word fellow usually follows it, as if with the intention of claiming that a fellow in a lodge was equally a master. Usually the distance assigned, within which attendance at the assembly is compulsory, is 50 miles, which gives 100 miles diameter in a circle round a common center. All these later charges are the basis of the esoteric receptions then and still in use. These later constitutions are in main agreement with the Watson manuscript and the preface to the Cook manuscript, which state that the great patron of Masonry in France was Charles II, the Karl II of the German catechism, and the grandson of Charlemagne, respecting which we volunteered some remarks in our last chapter. But in the later manuscripts, however, the correction has been reached. A return has been made to Charles Martel, who, though only regent of France, was the accepted patron of stonecutters in France before the 13th century. Possibly Secundus was a German error either for Magnus or for Martel, and obtained credence in England. The instructor of Martel has a name that has puzzled most Masonic scribes, as he appears in endless forms, amongst others Namus Graecus, Manus Graecus, Mammongetus, Namus Granaeus, etc. And he had wrought at the building of Solomon's temple with Ammon, Aimon, Anon, etc. It is possible that the origin of the name was from Nimes in southern France, then from Namus to Marcus Graecus, a philosopher of the 8th or 9th century, it is supposed, though not heard of until the 13th century, and when in the 16th century the name was disfigured beyond recognition and Caxton had printed The Four Sons of Ammon, which contains a Masonic legend, then Ammon was adopted. The name Ammon was used in baptism, as Cornelius Agrippa gave it to his firstborn son. Simon Granaeus also obtained countenance from his eminence as a geometrician. Brother Schnitger, in his commentary upon the manuscript Charges, printed by the Newcastle College of Rosicrucians in 1893, suggests that the difficulty in regard to Namus, laboring at Solomon's temple, and then instructing Charles Martel, may be got over by reading it that he was one who had been at the buildings of Solomon's temple, that is, had visited the site. All these later constitutions preserved the relations as to Hermes, Pythagoras, and Euclid, and we cannot admit that the Masons who recognized these personages as, in some sort, their predecessors, were ignorant of the sublime spiritual geometry which underlaid their ancient philosophy. It is probable that in time we may adopt a theory developed in a paper before the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, 2076, by Brother Dring, that Carolus Secundus of the Cook manuscript is an error for Carolus Magnus or Charlemagne, and that Manus, Namus, or the man with the Greek name, was Alcuin Flaccus of York, also called Albines, who it was suggested might be the St. Alban therein mentioned, and who terms Charlemagne the wise Solomon, and speaks of the erection of the church at Aix-la-Chapelle as the work of this wise Solomon. The theory has the merit of rectifying the chronology, which is erroneous as it stands. The importance of York as a Masonic center would decline from various causes. In 1538, the monasteries were dissolved, and building requirements ceased for a time. This was emphasized by the suppression of the minor fraternities, brotherhoods, and guilds. One of the guilds thus suppressed at York had endured exactly for a century, and was named the Guild of Corpus Christi, and consisted of a master and 6 priests, who annually on Trinity Sunday regulated the mystery play of Corpus Christi, when every trade in the city was bound to furnish a pageant. This sacred drama existed at York in 1220. Another reason is that with the abolition of guilds, the existing livery companies lost even the lax hold which they had possessed over the trades, and the municipality of York and other cities had adopted a form of city freedom as early as the 14th century, which was granted by the Lord Mayor and Common Council to the apprentice who had served his term of 7 years. It was an exoteric mode resembling the esoteric reception of a Mason. An apprentice was bound by an indenture in which he took upon himself rules of conduct, which are practically the same as those to which as a Mason he would have been sworn in lodge. This indenture was taken to the city clerk, who endorsed it, entered. At the end of his 7 years' apprenticeship, he repaired to the Guildhall and took an oath addressed to the Lord Mayor and good men that he would keep the privities and maintain with his body the freedom of the city. The clerk then charged him to protect the tolls and dues of the city and conferred the freedom. We have not the precise date when this form began at York, though there are lists of freemen from early in the 14th century. The same usage was in force at Boston in Lincolnshire, and lists of the apprentices freed are preserved there from 1559. It existed at Leicester, Norwich, Appleby, etc., etc. A like custom was adopted in Scotland and ordered at Aberdeen in 1641. Smith, in his learned essay on the Romano-German laws, which we have previously quoted, considers that the Roman collegia were the foundations of our municipal corporations, and says in England the guilds appear to have been the immediate foundation of the old municipal corporations. Many of the exclusive privileges, which are scarcely yet forgotten, and many of the customs derived from the guilds with regard to the exercise of a craft, have passed into common law, though now disconnected with the immunities derived from the municipality. At this period, and for long afterwards, the Crown had ample cause for uneasiness in regard to the assembly of any large body of men in the north of England. And no other portion of the kingdom so strongly resented the suppression of monasteries and guilds as did Northumberland, Durham, and Yorkshire. Brother Francis Drake, the historian, says that their dissolution inflicted a terrible blow upon the grandeur of York. The sick, the infirm, and all sorts of religious persons were turned out of house and home to starve or beg. A formidable rebellion was organized in 1537 under the name of the Pilgrimage of Grace, in which the leading men of the country, with the abbots of Fountains, Jervaux, and Rievaulx, took part. These pilgrims took an oath of their good intentions to church and king, and at their head marched a body of priests, habited in their vestments and with crosses in their hands. The leaders assumed characteristics such as charity, faith, poverty, pity. Their banner was embroidered with a crucifix, a chalice, and emblems of the 5 wounds of Christ. And the last mentioned emblems were placed on the sleeves of their robes, with the name of Jesus in the center. The rising was suppressed in Henry's usual brutal manner, but the dissatisfaction continued to slumber on, and must have caused the government to look with suspicion upon any considerable gathering of men, however innocent their intentions might be. This dissatisfied element was also very strong in South Durham, as well as North Yorkshire, and extended into Northumberland. A second and final rising occurred in 1569 under Elizabeth, but was as disastrous as the first. Though these recusants were often persecuted and large numbers hanged, they made no further attempt to regain their lost position. It is, however, known that they adopted secret modes of recognition, such as passwords, by which to recognize friends. One of these was Gibb, and Gibbs in a continental system was one of the 3 ruffians. We find nothing worthy of mention in the reigns of Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, or that of Mary, 1553 to 1558. But the long reign of Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603, has much to record. The old tradition recorded by Anderson that Queen Elizabeth sent an armed force in 1561 to break up the annual assembly at York is probably of an authentic character. He states that it was held under Sir Thomas Sackville as president, and that by his friendly management the assembly was allowed to continue its labors. There is an ancient song in reference to this which may be almost contemporary. The law complained querulously in 1548 that artificers made confederacies not to meddle with another's work, which is exactly what the Masonic charges had insisted upon from ancient times. In 1562, all previous laws are superseded by statute empowering justices to rate the wages of journeymen and forbidding the exercise of trades without an apprenticeship to such trades, which requirement is what Masons always contended for as a necessity of their trade. Anderson quotes the view of Judge Coke as to the statute of 1425, which he said was now abrogated, and adds that it confirms the opinions of old Masons that he was a faithful brother. It is asserted in Masonic histories that, up to 1561, York was paramount in Masonic government, but that North and South were now divided, and the existing remnants of the old guild system teach that the Trent was the division line. It is, therefore, probably a true statement. In the feeble rule of the Masons' Company and the existence of independent guilds, there is traditional basis for the foregoing statement, which seems to be represented by a southern version of the old charges. These manuscripts, for there are several copies, do not differ materially from the others except but in one or two points. They omit the Euclid charge, but that seems to be an accident of the scribe. Edwin is said to have been the son of a worthy king of England in the time of Knight Athelstan, thus referring to their father, Edward the Elder, and this Edwin was made a Mason at Windsor. Hebrew manuscripts are now said to have been produced at the assembly which Athelstan held at York, and there is actually a Jewish profession of faith before Solomon in use by the French sons of Solomon. The oath in these manuscripts is confirmed by the invocation of Almighty God, or as a copy of 1686, which is believed to have been prepared for the London Guild, whence sprang the Lodge of Antiquity, has it Almighty God of Jacob in place of By my Halidame. The most important script of this version is the Lansdowne manuscript, reproduced in facsimile by the Quatuor Coronati Lodge and supposed to have been in the possession of Lord Burghley, who died in 1598. There is some doubt of its alleged antiquity, and the changes made savour of Commonwealth times 1649 to 1660, when the Jews were readmitted. A critical examination of the several copies has been made by Brother Dr. W. Begeman, with the conclusion that there was an older version than any of the three versions examined. Such might have been Burghley's. If Queen Elizabeth did contemplate the suppression of the assembly at York, it would go before the law officers of the Crown, and the Secretary of State at that time was Sir William Cecil, a Lincolnshire man who was created Baron Burghley and is alleged to have possessed this constitution. He began the building of Burghley House about 1556, and it was continued down to 1578, and all details of the work were submitted to him. One of the Freemasons employed was Roger Ward. Peter Kempe was Clerk of Works, and Richard Shute Surveyor. We read 10th January 1562 of one Freemason that was hired by the year working upon the two windows of the court, in the letter of Kempe to Sir William Cecil. Burghley and Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was Lord Keeper, married two sisters, and Bacon died in 1578, leaving a son Francis, born in 1561, and created Baron Verulam and Viscount St. Albans in 1618 to 1619. Now, the following curious coincidences occur in regard to these three closely related persons of rank and ability. 1. This peculiar charge is supposed to have belonged to Lord Burghley. 2. The house of Sir Nicholas Bacon, called Gorhambury House in St. Albans, built about 1565, contains portraits of persons distinguished in the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and beneath each of these 2 Latin lines, expressive of benefits to be derived from the study of each. Grammar: Donatus, Lilly, Servius, Priscian. Arithmetic: Stifelius, Budæus, Pythagoras. Logic: Aristotle, Rodolphe, Porphyry, Seton. Music: Arian, Terpander, Orpheus. Rhetoric: Cicero, Isocrates, Demosthenes, Quintilian. Geometry: Archimedes, Euclid, Strabo, Apollonius. Astronomy: Regiomontanus, Halley, Copernicus, Ptolemy. 3. Francis, son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, wrote in 1624 the unfinished fragment called New Atlantis, or the House of Solomon, or of the 6 days' work. Many foreign writers of note have erroneously thought that it led to the establishment of Freemasonry, but it is likely that the writer had the Masonic Society in his mind and desired to show how its value might be enhanced. The 1620 edition of his Instauratio Magna, John Bell, London, has as engraved title a ship between 2 columns. In 1570, Sir Thomas Gresham built the Royal Exchange in London, and the movement to revive the Augustan style and depreciate the Gothic was general. The facsimile of a map of Portsmouth of this period shows the position of a Mason's Lodge. Probably a body was at work on some building at the port. In 1584, Sir Walter Mildmay founded Emmanuel College at Cambridge. A colony of Spaniards settled at Galway in 1584, and many of their buildings yet exist, and are said to resemble the older Moorish architecture. The north is in evidence in the year 1581. The Ordinary of the Company of Masons of Newcastle upon Tyne, dated the 1st of September of this year, constituted a body incorporated of themselves with perpetual succession. enjoined them to meet yearly to choose wardens, etc. That whenever the general plays of the town called Corpus Christi should be played, they should play the burial of Our Lady St. Mary the Virgin, every absent brother to pay 2 shillings and 6pence, and that at all the marriages and burials of the brethren and their wives, the company should attend to the church such persons to be married or buried. The arms attached to this paragraph are, on a chevron between 3 towers, a pair of compasses extended. Crest, a tower. Motto, "In the Lord is all our trust." It would seem that the intention of the Newcastle Council was to constitute a body held of themselves. At the same time, the lodge may have long existed and have sought a municipal charter to legalize their meetings. In reference to the Corpus Christi mystery plays, they are mentioned at Newcastle in 1426, but would seem from the ordinary to have been on the decline in 1548. The house carpenters, whose ordinary dates 1579, played the burial of Christ, and the masons that of St. Mary. The lodge may have been privy to the initiation of Sir Robert Moray in 1641 by a Scotch deputation, and had late meetings of their own. The Watson manuscript was discovered in the town, and is signed by Edward Thompson in 1687, who was doubtless a member of that lodge. The arms attached to it are identical with those assigned to the body of 1581. It is now known to have come through the hands of Dalziel, a member of Lodge 24. We shall allude to these masons again in later notices. The position of this ordinary of Newcastle needs a better explanation than that here given. Durham and Northumberland were a county palatine under the bishop, but Newcastle, as an important military station, was a county in itself. Previously to 1215, Newcastle was governed by bailiffs, but Henry III in this year ordered a mayor and 4 bailiffs to appoint a trusty moneyer and a sayer. But it was in 1400 that Henry IV chartered the town as a separate county with a sheriff, a mayor, and 6 aldermen. The Newcastle Ordinaries begin in 1426 with the Coopers. The Skinner's Ordinary of 1437 contains the names of the mayor, sheriff, and the 6 aldermen. In 1527, the weavers met in Carlisle Tower, and in 1532, the tanners had the Black Friary. The ordinary of the goldsmiths in 1536 included braziers, plumbers, etc., and they had to play the 3 kings of Cologne, the 3 magi who visited the infant Jesus at the Corpus Christi. It would seem, therefore, that an old Masters' Guild of Masons existed here which accepted its ordinary from the mayor, sheriff, and bailiffs in 1581. Whoever examines an old cathedral cannot fail to see that 2 classes of masons were employed on them, a class which did the level and square work, and a class which did the curved and arched work. Yet their separate duties was one of their trade secrets. Surprise has often been expressed that amongst these mystery plays there are none recorded as specially Masonic. Mackenzie states in his Cyclopedia that an arch-confraternity of builders existed in 1540 and enacted mystery plays in the Colosseum of Vespasian, and expresses belief that it still exists. There is some evidence that in 1561 Masonry at York was in a declining state, as the records say that their share of the Corpus Christi plays was given to the minstrels. Incorporations also continued to be granted by the bishops as Count Palatines, the Cordwainers of Durham in 1436. In 1559, Bishop Tunstall reincorporated the Barkers and Tanners of Gateshead. Up to 1565, the city of Durham had been governed by bailiffs, but in that year Bishop Pilkington incorporated the aldermen. In 1638, a charter was granted to the Freemasons, Rough Masons, etc., of the city of Durham. We gather from the Shore Statutes of 1598, the Warden General of James VI, that Edinburgh was a district governed by 6 men of ancient memory, who had to take trial of the offences. And these 6 of the most perfect and worthiest of memory had to take trial of the whole Masons within the bounds aforesaid. They appear to be the deacon masters and wardens of the old lodges, and they were authorized to pass fellows of craft after serving a 7 years apprenticeship, and another 7 years as journeyman unless the latter was reduced by the assembly and after making a trial piece. We see from this that to become a past master, a freed apprentice had to serve 7 years as a past fellow. A similar constitution was given to Kilwinning in 1599, and their 6 quarter masters were to appoint a famous notary as clerk. King James's sanction was awaited this constitution, and possibly there were other districts that may have had similar grants by the Lord Warden General. Thus we learn from a kill-winning minute that the 6 quartermasters of Cunning, Carrick and Barrowthrow in 1659 continued to meet once a year at Ayr to take order with the transgressors of the Acts of Court. There can be no question that these 6 in every case were duly past masters, and that they correspond with what we shall hear of as Harrods in Durham. For want of contemporary manuscript ceremonials, we will occasionally refer to Masonic symbolism in several countries. For identity of symbols and the mode of their application, press on towards the proofs that initiatory ceremonies were identical in all times. In Ireland, a mason's square was deposited in the east corner of the northern land pier of Bowles Bridge in Limerick. It bears date 1517 and was dug out in 1830. There's a heart at the angle on each side, and this inscription in one line at each side: "I will strive to live with love and care, 1517, upon the level by the square." In Coverdale's translation of Wermilieris's Spiritual and Most Precious Pearl, 1550, is the following: "The Freemason hews the hard stones, hews off here one piece, there another, till the stones be fit and apt for the place where he will lay them. Even so, God the heavenly Freemason builds a Christian church, and he frames and polishes us, which are the costly and precious stone with the cross, and affliction, that all abomination and wickedness, which do not agree unto this glorious building, might be removed and taken out of the way." Cowdery's Treasury of Similes, 1609. In the old church in Hanover, of which we made mention in our last chapter, there is a sundial with the date 1555, and the letters HBAS, which a chronicle of 1695 says alludes to Hans Buntingson, who loved his art and was well acquainted with the compasses and square and the great secret thereof. In the parish register of Much Wenlock in Shropshire is an entry of value, as it shows the meaning then attached to the word speculative as theory. It refers to dates between 1546 and 1576. Buried out of tenements in Madfold Street, next St. Owen's Well, Sir William Corvehill, priest of the service of Our Lady, in this church which 2 tenements belonged to the said service. He had them in his occupation in part of his wages, which was 8 marks, and the said houses in an overplus. He was well skilled in geometry, not by speculation, but by experience, could make organs, clocks and chimes, in carving, in masonry and silk weaving or painting, and could make all instruments of music, etc. All this country had a great loss of Sir William. He was a good bell founder and maker of frames. The same register records in 1599 that Walter Hancock's Freemason was buried 16 September. This man was a very skillful man in the art of masonry. A Melrose manuscript of 1581 alludes to loses or cowans, and contains a caution that he ought not to let you know the privilege of the compass, square, level, and the plumb rule. The master Winster, who gives the charge as a certificate to his freed apprentice, was evidently an Englishman, as he dates it in the 12th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Be it known to all men to whom these presents shall come, that Robert Winchester has lawfully done his duty to the science of masonry, as witness whereof I, John Winchester, his master Freemason, have subscribed my name and set to my mark in the year of our Lord 1581, and in the reign of our most sovereign Lady Elizabeth the 22nd year. Probably Robert Winchester was an English mason settling at Melrose, and the Constitution is further endorsed thus: extracted by me A.M. in Margin Andrew Main upon the 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th days of December anno 1673. Brother W.H. Rylands has contributed much information at various times upon Mason's marks, and amongst these we have those of Stonyhurst 1585, Bidston Old Hall 1590, Bromborough Manor House, etc. At Ayton Church near Nantwich is a monument of 21st April 1596 to Peter and Elizabeth Ashton. It has 2 shields of arms, one containing a 5-pointed star, and the other a square from which hangs a pair of compasses. The reign of James I, 1603 to 1625, is Masonically important. When he came to this country, he had at his own request been accepted a Mason by his master, Mason John Milner, who was deacon or master of the Scone and Perth Lodge. This is related in positive terms in the 1658 records of that lodge, and the king accepted membership in it. He claimed to be a patron of the learned, who designated him the Scottish Solomon. a rising artist who had professionally made the tour of Italy, under the patronage of Thomas, Earl of Pembroke, named Inigo Jones, was employed by the king in 1607 to build a new banqueting hall at Whitehall, and Anderson asserts that at this time many wealthy and learned men were received into the craft. In 1649, he and Stone were engaged to repair St. Paul's. Part of Wigan Church was rebuilt in 1620, the rector having a charter from Richard III as Lord of the Manor. It is the seat of irregular lodges in recent times. In the reign of Charles I, 1625 to 1649, whom Anderson claims as an initiate, many erections were made under the superintendence of Inigo Jones, who died in 1652, aged 80 years. Anderson, 1738, cites a manuscript by Nicholas Stone, which was burnt in 1720, to show that Jones remodeled the lodges after the manner of the schools, or academies of designers in Italy, of which we gave a specimen in the Cucchiari of Florence, chapter 6. He is said to have held quarterly communications of the masters and wardens of lodges, and Nicholas Stone was a warden of these assemblies. Possibly the system of the guild which built St. Paul's was the system remodeled by Jones. The Stone family was actively employed at this time and were no doubt members of the Masonic Society. Nicholas was born in 1586 at Woodbury near Exeter and buried at St. Martin's in the Fields in 1647. And the records of the Masons' Company prove that he was a member of the speculative lodge there before 1639. He had several sons. It is recorded upon the monument of his son, Henry, at Long Acre, that he spent the greater part of 37 years in Holland, France, and Italy, and died in 1653. Therefore, he may have been known to Getudi Leon, mentioned later. He also seems to have been a member of the Masons' Company Lodge in 1649. A somewhat interesting inscription appears on a tablet in the chancel of Sidbury Church in Devonshire, to the memory of John Stone, Freemason, who died 1st January 1617. On our great cornerstone this stone relied, for blessing to his building, loving most to build God's temples. In works he died, and lived the temple of the Holy Ghost, in whom hard life is proved, and honest fame. God can of stones raise seed to Abraham. Mackey quotes a sentence of 1607. Yet all this form of formless deity drew by the square and compass of our creed. In the year 1619, 2 books were printed in London, one having the title Keep Within Compass, the other Live Within Compass. An old black-letter book on bees, printed at London by H.B. 1608, is dedicated to the worshipful master and gentleman, and although the patron's name and profession is not given, it proves the use of a certain title at that date. In Speed's description of Britain, 1611, we have some characteristic language of a Masonic caste, worth reference. Applying myself wholly to this most goodly building has, as a poor labourer, carried the carved stones and polished pillars from the hands of the more skillful architects to be set in their fit places, which I offer upon the altar of love to my country. Dating from 1620, Brother Edward Conder, Jr., has given us some valuable information in regard to the speculative lodge of the London Company of Masons, which met from time to time in their own hall, accepted Master Masons, and had a framed list of such, now unfortunately lost. The fees, 1622, are thus recorded: as a gratuity to the company, £1, 0 shillings, 0 pence, for being made a master, 3 shillings, 4 pence, fee for entrance, 6 pence. The company preserved the names of the accepted Masons in a fair enclosed frame with a lock and key. The inventory of 1660 and 1675 mentions one book of the constitutions that Mr. Flood gave. In 1629 to 1633, the celebrated Dr. Flood has various symbolic allusions to his wise brethren who are laboring as architects. The lodge had also a set of 1481 laws for the governance of the livery. In 1649, certain persons were admitted on the livery after accepting Masonry, or in other words, after initiation and passing as masters. This proves that Anderson had grounds for expressing a belief that in former times, members of the Masons' Company had first to be admitted in a private lodge, and also that continental writers had slight grounds for their belief that Freemasonry arose at Mason's Hall. Brother J. Ross Robertson, Provincial Grand Master of Canada, alludes to a boulder stone with square and compasses, and the date 1606 indented upon it, which was discovered in 1827 on the shore of Annapolis Basin in Nova Scotia. Brother Hosier mentions in the Bahuta of 1889 that amongst the portraits of his ancestors is one of 1624 of Jacob Hosier, which represents him decorated with Masonic emblems and using the Master's sign. In Derry Keegan, County Antrim, is a tombstone of Robert Carr, who died 1617. It appears to have Masonic application to family arms. The top is a species of shield. Quarterly, first and fourth, a sun or star of 11 points. Second and third, a deer's head upon which is a square. A lodge at Berwick upon Tweed has an old armchair of 1641, which may be described as a carved shield of arms. A chevron between various Masonic emblems. In the lower division, a circular body, apparently an armillary sphere, and 1641 above the chevron, a pair of compasses and square, and reversed back to back with the others, square and compasses, in chief a scallop shell between two circular or floral emblems with a raised point in the center. Of Commonwealth times 1649 to 1660 there is nothing that need be specifically named. Speculative Masons have no lodge minutes of any antiquity in England, such as they have in Scotland. And though these are rather a puzzle to us than of serious value, our want of such is regrettable. Besides the paucity of the material to be found in such minutes, there is the fact of their dependence upon the Master's incorporations, and a doubt whether the rituals of Scotland and England were identical, though no doubt they had in ancient times been so. The Jews were readmitted in Cromwell's time, and Catholic attacks in France alleged that he founded Masonry. In 1655, the London Company dropped the title of Free, presumably because there existed independent guilds of Freemasons, and Robert Paget, who signed the manuscript of 1686, now in possession of Lodge Antiquity, was not a member of the company. The kill-winning records show between 1642 and 1656 that the lodge consisted of fellow crafts or masters and apprentices. Apprentices on entering paid 20 shillings, and fellow crafts at passing 40 shillings Scots, with 5 shillings additional for their mark. This incidentally confirms certain old catechisms which make the fellow craft degree to consist of 2 parts, the master's part being the second portion. Scotland certainly had, in some sort, 2 degrees in their lodges, whilst the chair and workmasters were in the incorporations and had their trials upon admission, opening and closing prayers with oaths, as in the English companies. In neither company, at any time in their history, does the society seem to have confined the lodge receptions to operative Masons. And certainly in the 17th century, amateurs and gentlemen were accepted in both countries. In Scotland, the non-operatives were termed geomatic, and the operatives domatic, thus distinguishing geometers and house builders. Nor can we form any other opinion of the constitutions during 1,000 years when they tell us that it was a society for all trades using geometry, and we see clerics as leading members. A lodge was held at Newcastle by deputation on behalf of the Lodge of Mary's Chapel, the 20th May 1641, under commission to Robert Mackay, General Quartermaster of the Armies of Scotland, to receive Sir Robert Moray. Amongst those present were General Hamilton and John Milne. This latter family were master masons to the kings of Scotland for many generations, and for 5 they were members of the Lodge of Mary's Chapel. The last of them was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in 1811, having been surveyor of that edifice for 50 years. In 1646, Elias Ashmole was made a mason in a lodge at Warrington, and it is now ascertained that the majority of the members present were not operative masons. Amongst the Sloane manuscripts is a copy of the Masonic Charges, endorsed by Robert Sankey in 1646. The name is a place name and that of an old Warrington family. The reign of Charles II extended from 1660 to 1685. Anderson asserts that he was made a Mason abroad during his exile, which is not improbable and may have been traditional. In a proclamation of 1661, he advocates the building in brick and stone in place of timber, for the safety and beauty of London, the former being equally cheap. Early last century, the clerical enemies of Masonry in France attributed a Cromwellian use to Masonry. But on the other hand, and with more probability, there has existed a Masonic belief that the lodges were used by the Stuarts to further the return of Charles II, and Brother Charles Purton Cooper, past Provincial Grand Master, has given us a note to the effect that Jusso 1741, who was acquainted with the Chevalier Ramsay and often conversed with him on Masonry, had learned from him that the restoration was prepared by the Freemasons and the General Monk belonged to the lodges. The Wise Man's Crown, 1664, alludes to the late years of tyranny, in which Masons, who are mixed with other trades in the notice, were allowed to write and teach astrology. The affinity between the two must lie in the abstruse geometrical and mathematical calculations required in both professions. Brother George E. Turner, some short time ago, bought from a widow a quantity of Masonic scraps, amongst which are 27 plates, apparently torn out of various books, and referring chiefly to the ancient gods and mysteries. These he printed in 1896 at Blandford, and from the mode in which they were acquired, we give them with reserve. One of these is a readable set-off from an alleged work entitled Treatise on Freemasonry, with dedication to the Earl of St. Albans, 1670. A fragment of printed matter on one of the plates mentions a duodecimo tome of 1539 entitled Solis Adoraio, which alludes to Freemasonry and says Lord Danby died 1643. Sir Gilbert Gerhard, named in Sister's Will 1637, Sir John Brooke, created Baron Cobham 1645, and many others, noted members of the order, were of this opinion, whatever that may be. The Scottish Kirk was tainted with the narrow-mindedness of the times of the Commonwealth, as is proved by an attack upon one of their own ministers. Extracted from the manuscript records of the Presbytery of Jedburgh, parish of Minto, by the Reverend J. Thompson Grant. 1652, James Ainsley AM, called 11th January and admitted and instituted after being sustained by the General Assembly. 9th December, 1652, objection having been taken because he was a Freemason, and the neighbouring presbytery consulted previous to entering him on trial. The Presbytery of Kelso, 24th February 1653, showed that, to their judgment, there is neither sin nor scandal in that word, because in the purest times of this Kirk, Masons having that word have been and are daily in our sessions, and many professors having that word are daily admitted to the ordinances. Two other references, 1678 and 1691, as to the nature of this word, have recently come to light. The first is from the letters of the Reverend George Hickes, D.D., Dean of Worcester, amongst the manuscripts of the Duke of Portland. He says, "The lairds of Roslin have been great architects and patrons of building for many generations. They are obliged to receive the Mason's word, which is a secret signal Masons have throughout the world to know one another by. They allege it is as old as since Babel, when they could not understand one another and conversed by signs. Others would have it no older than Solomon. However it is, he that has it will bring his brother Mason to him without calling to him or you perceiving the sign." The other notice is from a manuscript in the Advocate's Library entitled The Secret Commonwealth by Mr. Robert Kirk, Minister of Aberfoyle, 1691. It contains the following: "The Mason's word, which, though some make a mystery of it, I will not conceal a little of what I know. It is like a rabbinical tradition. In way of comment on Jachin and Boaz, the two pillars erected in Solomon's temple in the first book of Kings, chapter 7, verse 21, with an addition of some secret sign delivered from hand to hand, by which they know and become familiar one with another." Much nonsense has been written by modern Masons by way of proving that Scottish Masonry consisted in a single word, but there is no doubt that well-informed initiates meant more by it than 4 letters, in the same way that Plato and St. John meant more than the 5 letters in Logos. An oath must have had some ceremonial. The traditions of the ancient Masonic guilds are not to be altogether despised. The actual Guild of York is said to have claimed a date from Anno Domini 79 in the time of Agricola, and there was a Carpenters' Guild which claimed to date from Anno Domini 626. The former built a Roman temple at that time, and the latter a church of wood on the model of the Tabernacle of Moses. like the old operative lodge of which the Duke of Richmond was master, which claimed to date from the time of Julius Caesar, it would seem to have been the fashion of the guilds to claim from some great ancient work. Thus there was an operative lodge at Berwick which claimed to date from the erection of the Great Wall to keep out the Picts. The detached printed notices which we have of Freemasonry in England during the reign of Charles II show that small lodges were scattered over the country, independent of each other, but with a copy of the old constitutions as its rite of assembly and with a formal ceremony of reception. All trades are admissible, and gentlemen affect their company. Here and there, as we might expect, one lodge seems more faithful to the old traditions than another. It is evident that in the 17th century the speculative or geomatic element was becoming predominant, and that an attempt was made to retain the society in its old groove and to keep on foot the General Assembly. This is indicated in the existence of several copies of the old manuscripts which contain a code headed New Regulations. It is quite probable that there was an earlier and a later formal adoption of this code. Two of these manuscripts, the Harleian and Grand Lodge No. 2, have been printed in facsimile. Yet we have no record either of the date of these or the place where the assembly was held. They are supposed to be early 17th century, but Anderson says that they were adopted, though it may be readopted with the addition of an article limiting the reception to persons of full age at an assembly held on the 27th December 1663 under the Earl of St. Albans. Critics admit that none of the existing manuscripts are copied from each other and that there was an older copy not now extant. A version was printed by J. Roberts in 1722 which states that the new laws were adopted at a General Assembly held at 13 dashes which may read the City of York on the 8th day of December 1663. The new laws of this latest charge enact that in future the craft shall be ruled by one master and assembly, and that there shall be present a master and warden of the trade of operative Freemasonry, and that certificates were to be given and required. The Grand Lodge No. 2, Roberts, and the manuscript seen by Anderson contain a clause which is not in the Harleian manuscript, that no one shall be accepted if under 21 years of age. Possibly this indicates the 1663 revision of an older form. Attached to these new regulations is, for the first time, a separate apprentice charge, which closes with an oath of secrecy and indicates that apprentices and fellows had a ceremony of reception. A York origin for this form may be thought to be indicated by the fact that most of the copies in which the apprentice charge appears are found in the north of England. The form was used at Bradford and elsewhere 1680 to 1693, at Alnwick 1701, and is minuted in 1725 at Swalwell. Brother Conda, however, considers that it originated with the London Company of Masons. There are no minutes now preserved at York of the 16th and 17th centuries, but there are other proofs that assemblies continued to be held. There is a copy of the charges which was discovered at the demolition of Pontefract Castle, where persons sent their documents for safety during the civil wars. It is supposed to date about the year 1600 and contains an anagram upon the name of Masonry, William Kay to his friend Robert Preston upon his art of Masonry as followeth. Much might be said of the noble art, a craft that's worth esteeming in every part. Sundry nations, nobles and kings also, oh how they sought its worth to know. Nimrod and Solomon, the wisest of all men, reason sought to love this science then, I'll say no more, lest by my shallow verses I, endeavouring to praise, should blemish masonry. Another manuscript was found at York, circa 1630. There is also a mahogany flat rule of 18 inches containing the following names. It is considered that John Drake was cousin of the Reverend Francis Drake, who was collated to the prebendal stall of Donnington in 1663, and father of the historian of the same name, William Baron of York, 1663. Before 1660, there existed a lodge at Chester of which Randall Home was a member. A copy of the charges written by himself is number 2054 of the Harleian manuscripts, which contains the ordinary information and 2 fragments. There are several words and signs of a Freemason to be revealed to you, which, as you will answer before God at the great and terrible day of judgment, you keep secret, and not to reveal the same in the ears of any person, or to any but the masters and fellows of the said Society of Freemasons. So help me God. The second fragment is a list of fees, and no doubt a lodge list, beginning, William Wade would give for to be a Freemason. 25 names follow, paying sums from 5 shillings to 20 shillings. Brother W.R. Rylands has shown that it was a speculative lodge, embracing many who did not follow operative Masonry. In his Academy of Armory, 1688, Randall Home, a member of the above lodge, says, I cannot but honor the fellowship of the Masons because of its antiquity, and the more as being a member of that society called Freemasons. In being conversant amongst them, I have observed the use of their several tools following, some whereof I've seen borne in coats of armor. Lord Egerton held a special provincial Grand Lodge at Chester on the 18th of April, 1892, to erect a memorial to this old brother, and quoted the following words of his, as written above 200 years ago. By the help of Masonry, the most glorious structures in the world have been set up, as if their art had endeavored to imitate the handiwork of God in making little worlds in the great fabric of the universe. The tomb of the third Randall at Chester, erected by his son, has the skull and crossbones. There is an interesting document at Gateshead dated the 24th of April, 1671, which the Bishop of Durham granted as a charter of incorporation of a community, fellowship and company to make freemen and brethren. Amongst the charter members are Miles Stapleton, Esquire, son of Brian Stapleton of Myton, County York, Henry Fressel, gentleman, Robert Trollope, Henry Trollope, and others, masons, carvers, stonecutters, and various trades mentioned therein. It would seem to represent an ordinary Masters Incorporated lodge of the time. They were to assemble yearly on St. John the Baptist's Day, and to elect 4 to be wardens, and a fit person to be clerk. Each warden was to have a key of the chest. On the dexter margin of the charter are various trade arms, those of the Masons, azure, on a chevron between 3 single towers, a pair of compasses, crest a tower, motto. In the Lord is all our trust. On the sinister side are the arms of the sculptors. The Masons' arms are the same as those in the manuscript of 1687 written by Edward Thompson and termed the Watson manuscript. As a master's fraternity, it would hold craft lodges, and as Haradim would rule them. There is an early grave cover in St. Nicholas Church, now the cathedral, with a floriated Greek cross lengthened. On the left side is a fish, and on the right a key. It is said to have had an inscription to the architect of the Newcastle Town Court, built in 1659. The 2 Trollopes who are mentioned in the bishop's charter were Masons of the city of York. The inscription to Robert Trollope is said to have been as follows: Here lies Robert Trollope, who made yon stones roll up. When death took his soul up, his body filled this hole up. It may be mentioned here that Brother Horace Sweet, Doctor of Medicine, described in 1872 a tobacco box, which he says formerly belonged to the Jacobite John Drummond, created Earl of Melfort in 1695. And which, with the date and initials JD 1670, contains emblems identical with those of the catechisms of 1723. It is not probable that Christopher Wren was a Mason accepted at this period, though it is said there is an Arch-Guild minute of his reception in 1649, but no doubt his colleagues the Strongs were such. Valentine Strong, son of Timothy of Little Berrington, is termed Freemason, and was buried November 1662 at Fairford, Oxfordshire. He was father of Thomas Strong of London and of Edward Strong Sr., who with his son laboured at St. Paul's. Thomas laid the first stone on the 11th of June 1677 and brought from Oxford a lodge of Masons for whom a special act was passed to make them free of London for 7 years. He died in 1681, and his brother Edward laid the last stone on the 26th of October, 1708. Hayden, in his Dictionary of Dates, page 51, mentions the Court of Arches is so called from its having been held at the Church of St. Mary le Bow, London, whose top is built on stone pillars erected archwise. An old record says that it was built by companions of the Arch-Guild and was designed by its master and was considered a masterpiece. The bowmakers' guild included bow carpenters, who had the construction of the wooden centers to build arches. It is said that Strong was a member of the Arch Guild and that they received Christopher Wren in 1649. They reckon 7 degrees as in the craft, but where the latter held as symbols 3 straight rods to form a square, the architectus, of whom there were 3, had curved rods with which to form a circle. They only used compasses and employed themselves in curved, and in assemblies they sat in circular and not in square fashion. Elias Ashmole records his own presence at a lodge in London in 1682, and Brother Conder makes no doubt that it was the speculative lodge held at Mason's Hall by the company on the 10th of March, 1682. Ashmole says that he was the senior fellow present amongst a number whose names he gives, and that there was admitted into the fellowship of Freemasons Sir William Wilson, Knight, Captain Richard Borthwick, Mr. William Woodman, Mr. William Gray, Mr. Samuel Taylor, and Mr. William Wise. The next printed notice is one of 1686 by Robert Plott, Doctor of Laws, in his Natural History of Staffordshire, wherein he says, "To these add the customs relating to the county, whereof they have one of admitting men into the society of Freemasons, that in the moorlands of this county seems to be of greater request than anywhere else, though I find the custom spread more or less over all the nation. For here I found persons of the most eminent quality that did not disdain to be of this fellowship, nor indeed need they, were it of that antiquity and honour that is pretended in a large parchment volume, that they have amongst them, containing the history and rules of the craft of masonry." He then goes on to give an account from the old Masonic manuscripts, and the nature of the copy which he had seen is indicated by his stating that these charges and manners were after perused and approved by King Henry VI and his council. He then describes the mode of admission with signs whereby they are known to each other and the obligations of mutual assistance. He then comments in an abusive manner upon the society and thinks the old acts against the society ought to be revived. The names of Ashmole, Boyle and Wren appear amongst the subscribers to the work. Aubrey next mentions the society in his Natural History of Wiltshire, page 277. Sir William Dugdale told me many years since that about Henry III's time, the Pope gave a bull or patent to a company of Italian Freemasons to travel up and down over all Europe to build churches. The manner of their adoption is very formal and with an oath of secrecy. Memorandum, this day, May the 18th, being Monday, 1691, after Rogation Sunday, is a great convention at St. Paul's Church of the Fraternity of Adopted Masons, when Sir Christopher Wren is to be adopted a brother, and Sir Henry Gooderick of the Tower and divers others. There have been kings that have been of this sodality. There is no doubt these 3 interesting accounts give an accurate view of the state of Freemasonry in England at the time. Both an arch and square guild existed at St. Paul's in 1675, and minutes have been preserved with extreme care. Its ceremonies are known to the writer, and it sent a branch into Derbyshire to build Chatsworth, though in the jurisdiction of York. Some 30 or 40 years ago, an assembly of about 400 could be expected annually, and it is not yet extinct. The St. Paul's Guild was quite independent of the Masons' Company, which in 1677 obtained a charter from the king. One of their initiates is now at Aswan, and affirms that an ancient Jewish guild exists there, and that they practice Solomonian ceremonies with exactly the same rites as he received in 1866 to 1876. They have a plan of a quarry, of 3 rooms through which the stone is perfected, and near thereto are other 3 for the officers and a site for the building. Egypt has a slant masons guild unknown here. A properly constructed lodge room in these several offices or yards would have double folding doors, forming a porch to each where the preparation takes place. Solomon's temple is said to have had only a single door in the east. The first officer sits in the west, the second in the east, and the third in the north. And this applies to all the 6 sections. In the modern Freemasonry of 1717, they sit east, south, and west, or with their backs to their assigned duties. Their carpet has squares of 1 cubit, and the border is a lozenge 8 by 6 inches, a figure which includes the 3-4-5 angle 4 times repeated. All stones are sent from the quarry to the first yard and dressed 1/16 larger than required. In the second yard they are trued to their required size, and in the third are marked and fitted for the site. The 5th, 6th and 7th offices are overseers. Now, as to the ceremony continued to our own day, the candidate passes through the same process and, as a living stone, is first taken as a boy, rough-dressed, then polished and advanced. 1. Apprentice, received by a ceremony similar to the first degree in speculative Freemasonry. 3 officers are sent out to prepare him in the porch. He bathes as in the ancient mysteries, is refreshed with food, clothed in the white Roman cloak, examined by the doctor, and finally admitted on the report of the 3 officers sent out. He remains a brother 7 years, but is not a Freemason as in the speculative system. 2. Fellow. At about 21 years of age, the brother applies to be relieved of his bond, is accepted as a square fellow by a ceremony similar to the 2nd degree of modern Freemasonry. 3. Superfellow, after 12 months, is marked as a living stone and sent to the site. He is instructed in marking and fitting the actual stone. 4. Superfellow erector, knowing the system of marking, he knows how to join the stones and is himself erected in that position. If it has any connection with modern masonry, it is the first part of the 3rd degree. The 2 sections, however, are found in the degree of markman and master. 5. Superintendent. These represent the 3,300 Monachskim of Solomon. They are foremen, and were of old termed cures or wardens under the master. Receives technical instruction, has 10 men under him as intendant. 6. Past masters. These are the ancient Harods or chiefs, of whom there were 15. The qualification absolutely required is that of a modern architect. The ceremony of reception is of a most solemn character and cannot be given publicly. 7. Grand Master. There are 3 of these, co-equal, received in private. The degree has no analogy in modern Freemasonry, except in the 3 principles of a Royal Arch chapter, which seems to have restored a portion of the old guild ceremonial. Annual commemorations given on the 2nd and 30th of October. 1. Laying foundation and fixing the center by 3, 4, 5 and by the 5 points. There is a portion referring to the 2nd temple, which has originated the modern Royal Arch degree. 2. A tragedy, and Solomon appoints Adoniram the 3rd Grand Master Mason. The 2nd part of the modern 3rd degree is taken from this. 3. The dedication. There is a symbolical sacrifice in the 1st or foundation. These rites should be performed by the Grand Master, acting in the 6th degree, and transferred to the site of the temple or 4th degree. All these commemorative ceremonies are Semitic, the rest might equally appertain to any nation. When first I heard of these ceremonies in 1856, the guild could number 400 members at the annual drama. There is a curious analogy between the 7 degrees of the guild and the 7 ranks of the London Company of Masons, which had a charter of incorporation granted in 1677 with a 7-mile radius. Conder gives these ranks as follows, page 139. 1. Apprentice, bound for 7 years to a member and paid 2 shillings 6 pence. 2. Freedom or yeomanry. 3. The livery or robes. 4. The court of assistants. 5. Renter warden. 6. Upper warden. 7. Master in the chair. These would have to be sworn, though no ceremony is mentioned. They had, however, the Guild Society's branch, and Conder considers that they were termed accepted because they were received as amateurs to qualify them for acceptance into the livery of the company. The Guild Masons say that before the advent of modern Freemasonry, they had 4 head guild houses, which ruled different parts of the country and are those given by Anderson. As I read Anderson, who wrote in 1738, guided by what we actually know before 1738, he can only mean that when in 1716 Anthony Sayer was elected Grand Master by some old brothers, he had one or more of some or of all these guilds, or is supposed to have had them. It seems an attempt to hoodwink the reader. Number 1, the Antiquity certainly continued to meet for some years at the Goose and Gridiron, the House of St. Paul's Guild, but modern numbers 2, 3 and 4 seem never to have met at the other 3 guild houses. The reign of James II, 1685 to 1688, was too short to leave its influence upon Freemasonry, but much of importance must have occurred in that of William III, 1689 to 1702, had the particulars been preserved. We do not doubt that 16 May 1691 is the actual date of the initiation of Sir C. Wren as an accepted Mason, even though a Master of the Arch Guild 1649, and with the Convention of St. Paul's, it may be conjectured that the connection of the accepted Masons with the Livery Company ceased to exist, if any existed, which the Arch Guilds deny. The notorious Pritchard, who wrote in 1730, makes 1691 to be the actual beginning of the quarterly communications, which ended in the formation of the Grand Lodge of 1717 by the dissidents who'd been members of a real guild. Dr. Anderson, in his Constitutions, 1738, writes that a lodge met at St. Thomas Hospital in 1691 at the instance of Sir Thomas Clayton, and on the authority of some brothers living in 1730, that 6 other lodges then assembled in London. And besides the old Lodge of St. Paul's, whose bastard offspring, according to the Guild, was the Lodge of Antiquity, which possesses a copy of the Masonic charges written by Robert Paget, clerk to the Worshipful Society of Freemasons for the City of London. He mentions one in Piccadilly opposite St. James Church, one near Westminster Abbey, which may be represented in a printed catechism of 1723 alluding to the Lodge of St. Stephen's, one in Covent Garden, one in Holborn, another on Tower Hill, and some others that assembled at stated times. These were probably no more than meetings at inns frequented by Masons. No doubt the Great Fire of London and the efforts of Sir C. Wren in restoring the city after that calamity would attract people from all parts of England, Scotland and Ireland and lead to the assemblies of Masons. In the north there is a copy of the old manuscripts at York of 1680, which concludes that at every meeting or assembly they pray heartily for all Christians. Another copy of 1693 includes the apprentice charge and has a peculiar reading which is doubtless ill-translated Latin. It reads, "Then one of the elders taking the book, and that he or she that is to be made Mason, shall lay their hands thereon, and the charge shall be given." It concludes, "These be the constitutions of the noble and famous history called Masonry, made and now in practice by the best masters and fellows for directing and guiding all that use the said craft. Scripted by me, Vicesimo Tertio die Octobris anno Regni Regis et Regina William et Marie Quinto Annoce Domini 1693. Mark Kipling. The names of the lodge: William Simpson, Anthony Horseman, Christopher Thompson, Christopher Gill, Mr. Isaac Brent, Lodge Ward." The Duke of Richmond seems to have been master of a lodge at Chichester in 1696. The minutes of Grand Lodge of 2 March 1732 contain an entry that Edward Hall was made a Mason by the late Duke of Richmond 36 years ago. Hall's petition was recommended by the Duke's son, who was then Grand Master, and the Chichester Lodge was registered by Grand Lodge as dating from the time of Julius Caesar. A lodge met at Alnwick, Northumberland in 1701. It was an operative craft lodge and may have kept more closely to old customs from its nearness to Scotland, where the ceremonial work was practically extinct, though the legal basis of Masonic guilds was still in force. We give 2 of the regulations of 1701 in regard to entering apprentices and accepting fellows. 5th item, that no Mason shall take an apprentice and give him his charge within 1 whole year after. Not so doing, the master shall pay for any such offence £0, 3 shillings 4 pence. 9th item, there shall no apprentice after he has served his 7 years be admitted or accepted but on the feast of Michael the Archangel, paying to the master and wardens £0, 6 shillings 8 pence. A minute of 21 January 1708 decrees that for the future no master, warden or fellow shall appear on St. John's Day or attend the church service at Alnwick without his apron and common square fixed in the belt thereof. We must carefully guard ourselves from the supposition that these past wardens and masters are those now termed such. They were the Menachim and Harrods, or superintendents and past masters of the old guild ceremonies. In the county of Durham up to 1813, wardens as well as other officers took the same OB as the master. The guild's OB, the master in the 6th degree and the minor officers in the 5th degree lodge. A similar operative lodge existed in Durham and is supposed to have been first established at Winlaton circa 1690 by a German ironmaster, which art had been established at Solingen from early centuries. From Damascus, thence it removed to Swalwell in 1725. This last date is later than the period with which we intended to close this chapter, but as it is considered to date from 1690, and as its lodge customs were similar to those at Alnwick and were maintained to the last unaltered, it is not inappropriate here. Its regulations are minuted in 1725, the penal laws that when a youth was taken as apprentice by a member of the lodge, his master was required to enter him within 40 days, in contrast to the 1 year at Alnwick, and a small fee was charged. The form by which the apprentice was entered is given in the minute book and is an abridgment of the history given in our charge. Of course, the apprentice charges, known to date between 1600 and 1663, are those he would be sworn to keep. Nothing is said about secrets, but the 8th Penal Law imposes a fine of £10, not faithfully to keep the 3 fraternal signs and all points of fellowship. When the apprenticeship expired, the youth was made free of his craft by the full ceremony. On the 21st March, 1735, the lodge went under the Grand Lodge of London, but retained its old customs intact for over 30 years afterwards. But we now read of 2 masters' grades, the one termed Harodim, spelled in the minutes Hierodium, given in a Grand Lodge, and the other termed English Master, and the presumption is very strong, and especially as a mutual recognition of fees are made, that Harodim was their old past master's ceremony. But we shall again refer to the nature of these rites in our next chapter as operative Masons. There was also an independent lodge at Hexham, but nothing is known of its history. In the minute book of the Hawfoot Lodge, Scotland, there is an entry under date 22 December 1701, after a missing leaf which clearly alludes to fellow craft work, as it says, "Of entry as the apprentice did, leaving out the common judge, gudge, luge. They then whisper the word as before, and the master mason grips his hand after the ordinary way." As we understand it, the common or apprentice part, who is a rough dresser, was omitted from the ceremony, and the fellow craft word was given in a manner similar to the former degree. But the Scottish system seems to have been so loose that very little reliance can be placed upon what we meet with in their minutes as a general custom, and it would appear that at times apprentices were present when a higher ceremony was conferred, and that the signs, tokens, and words were communicated privately, whispered, shown in the Bible, or given in a separate room. The regulations of the Old Dumfries Lodge, 20th May 1687, enact that on entering apprentices a fee of £10 Scots had to be paid, and when afterwards passed as fellow craft a fee of £5 Scots, in each case besides gloves and entertainment. A Scots pound is 1 shilling. If Professor Robeson is correct in his conclusions as to the operative masonry of Germany, and he seems to have carefully studied the subject, the instruction and therefore the ceremonies varied in that country. He says that there were Wortmaurers and Schriftmaurers, and that there were borough laws enjoining the masters to give employment to journeymen who had the proper words and signs, that some cities had more extensive privileges in this respect than others, that the word given at Wetzlar entitled the possessor to work over the whole empire, and that we may infer from some municipal decisions that the master gave a word and token for each year's progress of the apprentice, the word of the city upon which he depended, and another by which all his pupils recognized each other. The word and token were abolished in 1731 in favor of the script masons. At Halberstadt there is a copy of the German statutes of 2 December 1713, from which we gather that there were still 4 overmasters at Cologne, Strasbourg, Wien, and Zurich. These are designated old masters, as distinct from the old fellows who governed the craft. The first were a chief or arch-fraternity, the second were masters of lodges. A master who made his apprentice free of the craft had to bind him to keep the word concealed in his heart, under the pain of his soul's salvation. There's an old armchair at Lincoln, of the date of 1681. In a semicircular top is carved a hand holding a balance in equilibrium, and under it, Pieri, 1681, point. Below this are 2 stalks with leaves, each bearing what appears to be a passion flower. Beneath are 2 panels, one of which contains the double triangles and the plumb rule. The other panel has the square and compasses. A member of the family deems the chair to have belonged to William, 4th Earl of Kingston, Lord Chief Justice in Ayr, beyond Trent. In the graveyard of Slane Castle, Ireland, there is a tombstone to John Frau, who died in 1687. In the upper arc are compasses, Greek cross and square. The Freemasons Chronicle, 2 March 1909, says that in the Leicester Corporation Museum there is an old chair which 250 years ago belonged to a Freemasons guild which met at the White Lion down to 1790. Upon the back is a design to mark a square building and the letter B, and it is thought there may have been another with J. A second chair is said to have belonged to the Arch Guild. Until very recent times, our knowledge of what transpired in Ireland has been almost nil. But Brother Chetwood Crawley has recently shown that in 1688, a lodge of Freemasons, consisting of gentlemen, mechanics, porters, parsons, ragmen, divines, tinkers, freshmen, doctors, butchers and tailors, thus heterogeneously denominated in the 1688 tripos of John Jones as connected with the University of Dublin. It is further mentioned by Jones that a collection was made for a new brother, who received from Sir Warren, being Freemasonized this new way, 5 shillings. This new way may mean by some new regulation or simply in reference to the collection, but that was old guild custom. The tomb of John Abel of Sarsfield, Herts, 1694, has a representation of himself and his 2 wives. Between a circular hoop at the bottom is a square, and above that a plumb, over which is a pair of compasses. It is said that one John Moore settled in South Carolina in 1680 from England, thence removed to Philadelphia, and in a letter which he writes in 1715, he speaks of having spent a few evenings in festivity with my Masonic brethren. The celebrated Jonathan Belcher, governor of Massachusetts, was made a Mason in the year 1704, for he writes to a Boston lodge in 1741, "It is now 37 years since I was admitted in the ancient and honorable society of free and accepted Masons. There is a record at Newport, United States of America, that ye day and date, 1686 or 1688, we met at ye house of Mordecai Campunol, and after synagogue we gave Abram Moses the degrees of Masonry." If this took place, it would be operative Masonry, and I see no reason to express a doubt. We have alluded in the foregoing, and shall again, to Scottish customs the more fully because there are traces to be read between the lines that the advent of the Stuarts and later introductions of Scottish Masons into the South was instrumental in somewhat modifying the Freemasonry of London, and that what is taken for English is sometimes Scottish. Yorkshire is notably rich in the old charges, as besides those which formerly belonged to the York Grand Lodge, and are in possession of a modern lodge there are others in private hands, and in the West Yorkshire Masonic Library. It is stated in a manifesto of the Lodge of Antiquity, 1778, that there was one old manuscript in the hands of Mr. Wilson of Broomhead, near Sheffield, written in the reign of Henry VIII, which is now missing, and there appears to have been one dated 1560. The Lodge of Hope, Bradford, has a copy of circa 1680. It forms no part of our plan to give an account of these old manuscripts, but students of them are greatly indebted to the late brother Thomas W. Tew, past Grand Master of the West Riding, who had 8 of these in possession of his provincial library, printed and distributed at his sole cost. Amongst them are the Thorns W. Tew manuscript, circa 1680, the Waystell manuscript, circa 1693, and the Clapham manuscript, circa 1700. The rolls in possession of the lodge at York have also been printed by subscription. One of these, dated 1704, is headed with the same anagram on masonry as that of 1600, but addressed by Robert Preston to Daniel Moult. It also appears in a Newcastle roll, addressed by Richard Stead to his friend Joseph Claughton. There are other documents at York, but none older than the reign of Anne, 1702 to 1714. It seems that George Benson was president in 1705, and that he was followed by other gentlemen at each annual election. We learn also from an old copy of the charges which has passed into the possession of the Grand Lodge of Canada that a private lodge was held at Scarborough, Yorkshire, 10th July 1705, with William Thompson Esquire as president, when 6 members were received whose names will be found in the facsimiles executed for the West Yorkshire Masons. Last century, the Grand Lodge of All England at York had minutes from the year 1704. But they are not now to be found. They have, however, at the York Lodge some later parchment rolls, which to some extent take the place of minutes. The probability is that such information as we have prior to 1726 belongs to the operative guild. On the 19th March 1712, we read that several members were sworn and admitted into the Honourable Society and Fraternity of Freemasons by George Bowes, Esquire, Deputy President. In 1713, the ancient lodge held a meeting at Bradford, when 18 gentlemen of the first families were made Freemasons. Meetings were held each succeeding year at York, those on St. John the Baptist's Day in June, being termed a general lodge on St. John's Day, whilst the others are designated private lodges. This was 4 years before any movement was made in London, and the meetings at Scarborough and at Bradford are in agreement with the ancient constitutions, which state that the Masons were to hold an assembly in what place they would. And it seems very apparent that where the term general lodge is used as distinct from a private lodge, it is the tradition of the ancient assembly continued. Again in 1716 it is minuted on this parchment roll as follows. At St. John's Lodge in Christmas 1716, at the house of Mr. James Boreham, situate Stonegate in York, being a general lodge held then by the Honourable Society and Company of Freemasons in the city of York, John Turner, Esquire, was sworn and admitted into the said Honourable Society and Fraternity of Freemasons. Charles Fairfax, Esquire, Deputy President. Lists of the Grand Masters are found in any modern Masonic cyclopedia, but Brother Whitehead recently discovered in an old armorial manuscript that the name of Sir William Milner, Baronet, 1728, has been omitted, being the 798th successor from Edwin the Great, apparently claiming an annual election of Grand Masters from the year 930. However much we may regret it, yet we cannot blame the York brothers for the strict respect shown to the obligations. In such written documents as we have, the terms used are simply well-known guild terms. We can draw no inference on such slight grounds as to the nature of their ceremonies. We do not know from contemporary documents what they were, and we have no right to expect that we should know. We can only judge of them by what they were when publicity began to be given to Masonic rites in the 18th century. We have not the least warrant for thinking that, on the one hand, they took up new inventions and palmed them off as old rites, nor on the other hand can we hope that they were very much better than the Grand Lodge of London, and shut their eyes to all improvement of the ritual. They would be guided in this by old tradition and landmarks. We note that in the facsimile of the Stanley manuscript, 1677, it is closed with the tailpiece of a checkered pavement. The Tatler, for 9 June 1709, has an article upon a class of Londoners termed Pretty Fellows. The paper is believed to be by Sir Richard Steele and alludes to matters with which he seems to be acquainted, for he says they have signs and words like Freemasons, and a similar reference is found in the same journal for 1710. There is no record of Steele being a Mason, but there evidently was an impression that such was the case, for Picard, in his Ceremonies and Costumes, gives a medallion portrait of Sir Richard Steele on a screen, which gives a copy of the engraved list of lodges in 1735. As illustrating the state of things in Scotland at this date, we may instance a dispute which occurred with the Mary's Chapel Lodge in 1707. A portion of these withdrew and established without permission the lodge journeymen. Lodge Mary's Chapel objected to their meeting to take fees and give the Mason's word, and the dispute ran on for some years. The Masters' Incorporation was the legal head of such bodies, and the journeymen obtained leave to sue Mary's Chapel for such Masonic rites as the latter possessed. The Incorporation agreed in 1715 that the journeymen should have an act of allowance to give the Mason's word. From this circumstance, Brother R.F. Gould is inclined to think that the custodians of this privilege were the incorporations, and that this case is the old survival of a claim that the private lodges were agencies or deputations of the incorporations for that purpose. It is a reasonable and just conclusion, and however loose the lodges may have been in their working, we may feel sure that the incorporations were custodians of ritualistic catechisms, probably of a Christian nature, of all known grades in Masonry, whether the same were conferred or had lapsed. Brother Clement E. Stretton, who is eminent as a writer of books on his own line as a civil engineer, has stated in the journals of the day and confirmed to me by letters that Dr. James Anderson was made chaplain of the St. Paul's Guild in 1710 in succession to Dr. Compton, who had been in the habit of holding a daily service. In September 1714, Anderson proposed that men of position should be admitted to a species of honorary membership, which was carried by one vote, and the accounts in that and the following year show 7 fees of 5 guineas each. All the time St. Paul's work was in operation, the guilds met at high 12 on a Saturday. But Anderson changed the period of meeting to 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening at the Goose and Gridiron, and in September 1715 the operatives found that their old pass would not admit them, and they complained to Wren and Strong, and the dissidents were struck off the rolls, and this is probably why Anderson complained that Wren neglected the lodges. Now, under such circumstances, no honourable man can say that Anderson acted a creditable part, but we can see what he actually digested. He made the apprentice in a month in place of 7 years, struck out everything technical, including the ceremonies of conferring the mark Mason, and left a fine moral institution on the lines of the mystic societies of the ancients. But it is not Freemasonry, but an imitation of it. He retained as much of the old rites as suited his purpose and could be worked into the modern system, but it lacked the explanation the guild rites afforded. In the Stanley manuscript of 1697, facsimiled for the West Yorkshire Provincial Grand Lodge, there is a peculiar addition which is of later date. A very precise investigation of the allusions therein was made by Brother Gould in 1888, and he has come to the conclusion that the lines are applicable to 1714. It is supposed to have been a North Country manuscript, and we give the endorsement. The prophecy of Brother Roger Bacon, disciple of Balaam, which he writ on the northeast square of the pyramids of Egypt in capital letters. When a martyr's granddaughter in the throne of Great Britain, Mary, makes Capade's proud son look, you'd think him beshitten Louis XIV. When the Medway and Mars piss together in a quill, Kent and Holland, and Tagus and Rhine of the Seine have their will, Germanic Confederation. When the Thames has the Tay taken for better, for worse, Act of Union 1707, and to purchase the doxy has well drained his purse, Scotland. When by roasting a priest the church has her wishes, Dr. Sacheverell. Loyal Tories in places, Whigs silent as fishes, Anne's reign. When Europe grows quiet and a man that's right wily, Peace of Utrecht 1713, sets up a wood bridge from the Land's End to Chile, South Sea Company. Freemasons beware, Brother Bacon advises. Interlopers break in and spoil your devices. Your Giblin and squares are all out of door, and Yakin and Boaz shall be secrets no more. It is evident that York was more advanced than London in the practice of a system of speculative Freemasonry, because it had a more close operative derivation and was less reduced, and whether the lines above given originated north or south, they indicate the views of some old operative brother who saw changes which did not please him. Brother Edward Conder has recently shown that Viscount Doneraile must have held a lodge at his mansion, Cork, about the year 1710. At one of these assemblies, some repairs were in progress in the library when his daughter Elizabeth secreted herself to watch the ceremonies, but was detected and forced to undergo the rites of making and passing. As she was born in 1693 and married to Richard Aldworth in 1713, we may reasonably fix 1710 as about the date of the reception. Brother W.J.C. Crawley, Doctor of Laws, has gone also into this matter in Coementaria Hibernica, and expresses his opinion that similar lodges may have existed at the Eagle Tavern under Lord Ross and at Mitchelstown under Lord Kingstown. There is an Irish manuscript amongst the Molyneux papers endorsed February 1711, which clearly indicates a 3-degree system and is headed with a thus seen here. All the serious works which refer in print to the Society of Freemasons make no question of its antiquity, either during the 17th century or after it had passed into an entirely speculative system. The Antiquities of Berkshire by Elias Ashmole, London 1719, has a paragraph which includes the information given by Plott and Aubrey that we have before referred to. And we add some interesting particulars from the letters of Dr. Thomas Knipe, who flourished between 1660 and 1711, in which year he died, and which were used by the compilers of Ashmole's biography in 1748. This writer repeats the statement in regard to the papal bull of the time of Henry III, and goes on to say, but this bull, in the opinion of the learned Mr. Ashmole, was confirmative only, and did not by any means create our fraternity, nor even establish them in this kingdom. He then proceeds to give an account of the statements gathered from the old charges from St. Alban to the ratification of the Constitution by Henry VI, and closes with a statement that in the civil wars, the Freemasons were generally Yorkists, and abuses Plot for his injurious comments. In Scotland, technically, it would seem that a Scottish master was workmaster of the Dramatic Lodge and the chairmaster of the Geomatic Lodge, but who had to be examined and passed as a master, for it is to be presumed that non-operatives might be ritualistically dispensed from the 7 years probation required for a Fellow of Craft. Melrose had a very old lodge which kept to the ancient system until a few years ago when it joined Grand Lodge. There is a Melrose Minute of 1764 of which an unwise use is made. It enacts that the apprentice and fellow craft ceremonies, for that is what is meant, shall be administered in a simple way and manner free of anything sinful and superstitious. At this date it had 2 degrees, and the Preses was Master Mason. It only proves the presence of a puritanical spirit in the lodge. That there was a fellow craft degree in Scotland worked in lodges is proved by the charge of St. Mary's, Edinburgh, against the journeymen in 1713, that they presumed at their own hand to enter apprentices and pass fellow crafts in a public change house. From the middle of the 17th century, the Scottish minute books show numerous admissions of military men and of lairds who are designated by their lands. The Kelso Lodge, to which Sir John Pringle's name appears in 1701, in 1705 imposes a fine for absence upon Cornet Drummond and Lieutenant Bennett. The Hawfoot Lodge, opened in 1702 by John Pringle of Torsonse, leaves us in no doubt that it then conferred and passed apprentice and fellow craft, the Master Mason occupying the chair. Sometimes both degrees were given at one meeting, at others after an interval. The annual meeting was held for business, and a commission given each year to 5 members to initiate others. The lodge at Aberdeen had 2 classes, Geomatic and Dramatic Masons, and the admissions were differently worded for each. The Master was Geomatic, and the Senior Warden Dramatic, and this latter class had to make a trial piece for each degree. Old catechisms. The most important question with Freemasons will be by what sort of rites were these 17th century Masons received into the Brotherhood? And the answer must depend on the nature of the lodge which acted. It does not seem very difficult to form an approximate idea of this. There are various old catechisms which, though of doubtful authority and not wholly written in this century, are yet clearly of it, and moreover are in general unison with the reduced 16th and 17th century constitutional charges. There is one copy of these catechisms which the late Reverend Brother A.F.A. Woodford, who further quotes competent authority, considers from its archaisms to date 1650, if not earlier. And there are versions of 1723, 1724, 1729, 1730 and onwards. A copy was printed in the Scots Magazine of 1755 and is said to reveal an actual reception at Dundee in 1727. Although the general character of these catechisms is similar, they differ in detail. But the Dundee specimen is in close agreement with the one that Brother Woodford has attributed to 1650 or earlier, and which is found amongst the Sloane manuscripts and has been printed by him. It raises the question whether it is not actually a Scottish version brought south. All these documents, besides the recognition of some apprentice ceremony of an operative appearance, divide the fellow's part into 2 portions. First, the catechism of that degree which we now term fellow craft, and second, the degree now termed master. And this last is clearly defined in every copy that we have, and quite as clearly in the Sloane manuscript as in any other. They are all a debased version of the original system prevailing when it took some years to become an operative fellow, or master. Equally, some sort of mark or ceremony is in evidence. In Scottish lodges, such a system might arise from a desire to continue to confer a master's degree after the actual masters had incorporated, and in parts of England, where the fraternity ceased to be practical, from a desire to shorten the reception of fellow and master, in other words, to make an amateur into an apprentice, fellow and master in one evening. In any case, all give 5 points of fellowship as applicable to craftsmen, but in the ancient guilds they had a technical reference. Sometimes a past apprentice would appear to mean a fellow, and a past fellow a master. So loose is the wording. In all cases, however, the catechisms give certain secrets of the modern third degree, from which we may justly infer that they had knowledge of a certain annual rite or drama, and that if it should have passed out of practice, it was owing to the changed position of the lodge. Precisely the same thing has occurred amongst the guilds claiming medieval descent, of which many yet exist, and past masters have to be called in from a distance. One of the most expert workers is a York Mason. It is unnecessary to particularize much of these catechisms, but in our Chapter 8 we advocated on the evidence to be obtained from the Saxon charge, old operatives and the usages of societies similarly constituted, that the most ancient form of recognition was a salutation. And this is found in every catechism that has come down to us, until it was expunged in 1813. If this is correct, the most ancient Masons were salute Masons, the Freemasons were Hebrew word Masons. No doubt when this union took place, whether in the 13th century or any other date, it would be followed from time to time with revisions to correct inaccurate oral transmission. The salutation varies in these old manuscripts, but the following from the Sloane and the printed 1723 are given as specimens. Those of Germany were more elaborate, as they contained 7 prayers or words. The right worshipful, the masters and fellows, in that worshipful lodge from whence we last come, greet you, greet you, greet you well. The warden replies, God's greeting be at this meeting, and with the right worshipful the master, and the worshipful fellows, who keeps the keys of the lodge from whence you come, and you also are welcome, worshipful brother, into this worshipful society. In the Sloane manuscript there is found a Jerusalem word, Giblin, as well as a 2-syllabled word, Maharin, and doubts are thrown on a sign said to be given in France and Turkey, which may be considered in relation to what was said at the opening of Chapter 9. The Catechism of 1723 has the following lines: An entered Mason I have been, Boaz and Jachin I have seen. A fellow I was sworn most rare, and know the ashlar, diamond and square. I know the master's part full well, as honest Morbin will you tell. Then the master says, if a master mason you would be, observe you well the rule of 3, and what you want in masonry thy mark and Morbin makes thee free. The printed Catechism of 1724 represents a body qualified as a St. John's Lodge, a term we saw used in the oldest York minutes, and it is altogether in better form than some of the others. We find in it a version of an old Rosicrucian and Gnostic symbol, an equal cross with a triangle over it. It has also the word Ira, which no one has ventured to explain, but it occurs in the lectures of HRDMRSYCSS. Symbolism couched in rhyme is found in the Scottish and North England catechisms to a late period. In a manuscript of the old charges belonging to the Dumfries Lodge of date early 18th century is the following, but we have no space to quote the Christian catechism of the old temple symbolism found therein. Where ought a lodge to be kept? On the top of a mountain or in the middle of a bog, without the hearing of the crowing of a cock or the bark of a dog. What was the greatest wonder that was seen or heard about the temple? God was man and man was God. Mary was a mother and yet a maid. There can be little doubt that one of the customs here referred to originated in the British and Teutonic customs of holding a council, folkmoot or thing, freestool or vame, either on the top of a mountain or in the open, in the middle of a field, and every freeman had a voice in such courts. According to a manuscript of the learned Mr. Jones in the Cottonian Library, the early British kings, when they held a council either personally or by deputy, went to a certain private house or tower on the top of a hill or some solitary place of council, far distant from any dwelling, and there advised unknown to any man but the councillors themselves. The following lines of much interest appear in the Dumfries manuscript just quoted: a caput mortuum. Here you see to mind you of mortality. Behold great strength, by Herod fell, but stablishment in heaven does dwell. Let all your acts be just and true, which after death gives life to you. Keep round within of your appointed sphere, be ready for your latter end draws near. A formula of old transmission has the following: by letters 4 and science 5, this G aright does stand. Brother J.A. Cockburn of Adelaide thinks they are of very great antiquity. He holds that originally the G was the Hebrew Gimel, and the Greek Gamma, which is a mason's square, held sacred by the Pythagoreans and the Kabiric initiates of the earth goddess Ge or Gai. He further suggests that the primitive emblem may have been the swastika, which embraces 4 gammas and again represents the sacred tetragrammaton of the Jews. Plutarch says the number 4 is a square, and Philo says 4 is the most ancient of all square numbers. It is found to exist in right angles, as a square in geometry shows. Brother Sidney T. Klein, past master 2076, in a lecture upon the ancient geometry, says that the Greek gamma was actually the etymon or name designating the square in the earliest times. The same brother considers that the great secret of prehistoric geometry was how to make a perfect right angle in any desired position without possibility of error, and gives as illustration an Egyptian deed of 2000 BC. And a later papyrus of 1500 BC, both English and Coptic guilds still give it, and so did the old York lectures also. He shows that the ancient geometers had this secret, and that it could be made by means of the center from any straight line, or by taking any triangular line drawn from the circumference of a circle by the rope or skirt. On the formation of Grand Lodge, he says in 1717 every gentleman desired to be a master mason, and as the property of the square was assigned to one worshipful master, whilst the ritual retained the original wording, the symbolic illusion was lost, and the Euclidean problem was given to the worshipful master in place of the simple square. The ancient guilds have possessed this as a secret for ages and based much ceremony upon it. Malvern Old Church is said to have a curious window, but no information is afforded as to its date. In the left-hand division of the last window, at the east end of the south aisle, the subject alluding to paradise, in the top section is a figure before a dial column, the dial gone, holding in his right hand a square and a huge pair of compasses. In the next section of the same window, westward, is a figure kneeling, having a globe on a stand on a pedestal behind him with the moon, the sun, and 7 stars before him. A root of corn is at the foot near a stream of water, with a branch of acacia on raised ground. And in the third section is a figure prostrate on a piece of square pavement. The latter is, however, only a compilation of odd pieces of ancient colored glass. Brother Kerr of Scotland has written something in reference to an examination of the master's grade by 2 astronomers who decided it was some very ancient system. The celestial and terrestrial globes were rectified to the time of the foundation of Solomon's temple, and the signs and words were obtained, and the reason of the implements being used, the legend of the 3rd degree, also the name being thrice repeated, why the ear of corn and the waterfall are depicted, and the direction in which the procession moves. A lecture similar to this, but not covering all these points, embracing chiefly the Temple of Solomon as a type of the universe, is in the library of the Grand Chapter of Scotland, and attributed to Dr. Walker Arnott, an eminent Scottish Mason. The late Brother Albert Pike seems to have entertained a similar opinion, and argues for the identification of Hiram with the sun god. In Egypt, Horus is represented as seated upon lions, the same word meaning both sun and lion. Again, Hari is a Hindu name of the sun, and Kurum or Hiram is the Egyptian Her-Ra, Hermes, Hercules. He thinks certain assassins may possibly be recognized in the Arabic names of certain stars. When, by the precession of the equinoxes, the sun was in Libra in autumn, he met in the east where the reign of Typhon commenced. 3 stars forming a triangle. They are thus designated Zubin Eshmale in the west, Zubin Hakrabi in the east, Zubin El-Gabi in the south. Of these, the corrupt forms, he thinks, may be found in Jubila Gravelot, Jubilo Akirop, and Jubulum Gibbs. The theory of Brother Kerr's 2 celebrated astronomers might imply the arrangement of the rites by old astrologers. A similar theory is embodied in the Swedenborgian rite, which upholds the Masonic symbols as those of the most ancient races allied to the doctrine of correspondences. Thus, the master's degree is an astrological or astronomical allegory based upon the position of the stars in 5873 BC. The lodge is a symbol of the universe, also Dr. Arnott's contention. And the rites represent the building of God's temple in nature and the building up of humanity. It has a further reference to the erection of the Sukkoth, booths or lodges, erected at the Feast of Tabernacles. Brother Samuel Beswick, in his work on the rite, asserts that Emanuel Swedenborg was made a Mason at the University of London in 1706, and that this date appears upon a minute of 1787 when King Gustavus III presided, but that it is erroneously entered London. He also asserts that Charles XII, who was assassinated in 1718, had lodges and chapters or encampments in his army. The ancient guilds may have been continued in Sweden, and with reference to higher degrees, we have already mentioned the existence of Rosy Cross in the 15th century, and there was a similar non-Masonic society in the 18th with the king as chief. It is not supposed that any quarrel occurred at York to separate the operatives and the speculatives. The former continued to hold their meetings at High 12, and the latter withdrew to meet in the evening, and their ritual retained much of the operative customs not now found in the modern ritual of 1813. In the first degree, the candidate took a short obligation before preparation, in order that if he was rejected or withdrew, he might be pledged to secrecy, and the same system exists in the guild, as the boy is obligated in the porch before admission. On a York reception, he was invested with the operative mason's leather apron up to the neck, and as in the operative guild, he was shown how to hew the rough ashlar. In the second degree, he was thrice tested by the junior warden, senior warden, and worshipful master in the use of the plumb, level, and square. At the first and second rounds, he had to test the columns of the wardens, and the worshipful master required him to prove the perfect ashlar with the square. There is this difference, however, that the guild used the hollow square of the nature of a picture frame as a gauge both for the stone and the fellow. The third degree begins as fellow and ends as casual master. The old master's ceremony of York and the north of England contained much that is now omitted and had many points of resemblance to the ancient mysteries. The names of the criminals are given, and after the death of Hiram, the superintendent Adoniram succeeds him and is ruler of perfect masters. The details would read thus, on the lines of the ancient mysteries. Hiram the Abiv, or father of craftsmen, is lamented for twice 7 days, when the fraternity is gladdened by a reappearance in the person of Adoniram, the prince of the people. In real history, Adoniram was slain, whilst, according to Oliver, who quotes Dias and Menander, Hiram returned to Tyre, where he is known as Abdemonos. The York ceremony was a good representation of the aphonism and eurysis of the mysteries, respecting which Diodorus informs us that Egypt lamented the violent death of Osiris for 14 days at his tomb, referring to the lunation of the moon, after which they rejoiced on a proclaimed rising. In regard to the Masonic symbols, it is tolerably certain that the more recondite of these have been received by the Freemasons from the most ancient times, yet their actual signification became lost to the society, which ceased its connection with architecture, and in many cases, as we know, new meanings were assigned by the Grand Lodge in 1717. In reference to what has already been said of the perpetuation of a mark for tools and work, it may be pointed out that the custom was continued in Scotland when an apprentice was entered, and fellows had it in England according to the catechism quoted, and the remnants of guild life still have it. By the 1670 laws of the Aberdeen Lodge, the apprentice, besides other fees, had to pay 1 mark for his mark. The laws of this date enact that apprentices were to be entered in their outfield lodge in the parish of Ness, save in ill weather, when we ordain likewise that no lodge be holden within a dwelling house, where there is people living in it, but in the open fields, except it be ill weather, and let there be a house closed, that no person shall hear or see us. In the old Dumfries Lodge, number 53, by the laws of 1687, apprentices had to pay a mark Scots money, a signed mark. The Scots magazine gives a Dundee initiation of 1727 and has, "How got you that mark?" Answer, "I took up 1 mark and laid down another." In the catechism printed in England, we quoted the lines, "And what you want in masonry thy mark and morbin makes thee free." All the evidence which these documents afford us, rudimentary, aid memory, or fragmentary though they may be, point to this: that in some parts, and especially in Scotland, the ancient fellow and master of the General Assembly had become the apprentice and fellow of the lodge, first by swearing the apprentice to a charge, and then by reducing the 7 years qualification for fellowship, until finally there was little or no interval, But customs were not uniform, for there was no general central authority. In other cases where a stricter tradition was followed, the apprentice was sworn to a charge by some ceremonial, and at the end of his 7 years' apprenticeship was accepted a fellow by a formal ceremony, and then or afterwards received the more ancient secrets of a master mason, or, as in certain northern lodges, was created a harrod or ruling chief. For as the lodges ceased to be schools of architecture, there was no call to continue a strict examination for the title of a past master. This apparently was the view of Grand Lodge in 1717, adopted with some changes to suit a new state of things. It is quite open to belief, as modern critics contend, that when an unindentured man or a gentleman was made a mason in a lodge such as that of York, he would receive the whole degrees at once in a running ceremony. The guild received amateurs in the 6th degree only. It must therefore be true in a modified sense that fellow and master were convertible terms. It is all but certain that the speculative so-called revivalists of 1717 had oral or written catechisms of guild ceremonies. And we are told by Anderson that the 1721 meetings of Grand Lodge were made very interesting by the lectures of old Masons. At any rate, we are required to believe in their good faith, and that the men who formed the Grand Lodge of London in 1717 transmitted us what they had or could remember from the ancients, revised, subtracted, added a little it may be, but their chief alteration was eventually to make 3 ceremonies the rule of speculative Masons, and to contain in one form or another all which they had obtained from the ancient guild Masons, who, when they received an amateur, swore him only in the 6th degree. As they had now no use for an indentured apprentice, they divided the degree of reception into 2 portions, in our present apprentice and fellow craft degrees, revising somewhat the past fellow and adding a second part to their master's degree. At least they knew, however badly instructed they may have been, better what genuine masonry consisted of than the iconoclastic critics of near 2 centuries later. And we must bear in mind that we are dealing with a society that was established for secret and oral transmission of its mysteries, and which bound its members to absolute secrecy on every point under the most binding penalties. The whole allegory of a master, it has been observed, enforces the lesson that it is a danger even to allow it to be suspected that he possessed certain rights that were a certificate of his proficiency in the craft. Nor must we forget that speculative masonry was constituted as a triad society governed by 3s after the manner of the Druids. Shakespeare says that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, and the Grand Lodge established in 1717 is the same thing whether we call it by that name or term it assembly, congregation or chapter, as the ancient designations ran. Practically 1717 was the revival of a previous attempt to continue a ruling body without its rites and ceremonies. And from this period, Freemasons can have little doubt as to the nature of the society and its degrees so far as the ordinary craft mason is concerned. The supposed claim of the modern Grand Lodge to a full possession of the entire system of masonry was not universally acknowledged but denied, and led to York and other centres of Masons being termed ancients, whilst the Grand Lodge of London was designated modern. The guiding principle of the founders of the Grand Lodge rites was universality, and with antiquarian tastes and logical views, nothing was accepted as masonry but what concerned Solomon's Temple, and in adopting guild ceremonies they did so without reference to the Second Temple. The question arises here whether or not they were fully informed initiates, and that is very dubious. After a full consideration of all the facts produced in previous chapters, can we arrive at any other conclusion than this? That though Freemasonry of the present day may have undergone modifications in its ceremonies and changed with the manners of society, yet the general tone of its ritual has descended to us from the most remote antiquity. As to the second part of the master's ceremony on which so much criticism has been wasted, there can be no doubt that it has been taken from the yearly celebration of the guilds, of what is supposed to have occurred at the building of the temple. Throughout these pages, we have followed the ordinary histories which treat modern Freemasonry as a succession of the operative guilds, It is one of the descendants of these bodies, but lacking their technical instruction, and the abridgment which it has undergone can only be fully understood by placing the two rites in juxtaposition. It is, what else can we say, a moral and speculative imitation of the more ancient rites of the guilds, socially of a higher status but separated from them. And with the next chapter we enter entirely upon a speculative Freemasonry. Much confusion has arisen owing to writers attempting to trace Masonry from a special class of what were termed mysteries. We have seen that the early mysteries were guilds, and that even after caste influenced them and divided them into three sections, they were still all one, varying only in the names, etc. There were then 1, those of the priests; 2, those of warriors and agriculturists; 3, those of the artisans. All three were equally mysteries, all were equally guilds, equally one mystery, with like ceremonies varying mainly in the object and technical part of their rituals. Masonry is the only one of these that has come down to us unchanged at the date we close this chapter. They were a necessity to the priestly builders of temples and churches, and therefore encouraged. It must be admitted, however, that the modern rites have a remarkable reference to those of the Kabiri. It had 7 anthropomorphized gods of art, the number of a perfect lodge, of which 3 were chief gods, and one was slain by the others and buried in the roots of Olympus. It is said that the Roman Emperor Commodus, in initiating a candidate, was so energetic that he sent him to join his prototype. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.